You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my trowel.
Hey everyone, Chris Webster here, founder of the Archaeology Podcast Network. And during this holiday season, we are taking a short break and using this opportunity to present you with episodes from shows you may not be aware of. Today's offering comes from the Past Macabre, hosted by Stephanie Rice. This is a part one of her Archaeology of Boudica, Late Iron Age Britain and the Iceni. It's a pretty fascinating episode. And if you want to hear part two, go find the Past Macabre podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network or anywhere you find podcasts and subscribe. Onto the show.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 16. It's the first part of a 2-episode series on the archaeology related to one of Britain's most iconic and elusive figures of resistance, Boudica. Her rebellion is legendary, and her tale has been told and retold over and over and over for nearly 2,000 years. In spite of losing to Rome, Boudica is immortalized as a warrior queen who was an honorable enemy of the Roman Empire and ultimately held similar ideals as the Romans did. But how much truth is there in the legend? Was Boudica even real, or was she created by Roman propaganda? Archaeology can help us sift out the historical facts from literary embellishments to paint us a more complete picture of the Celtic tribes of Britain, how the different tribes interacted with the Roman Empire, and Boudica's revolt. In this episode, I want to give you a little context for the world Boudica was born into. It was a time of quick cultural, political, and economic change between the Late Iron Age to the Roman period. Julius Caesar led an expedition to Britain in 54 BCE and established the first official client kingdom alliances with the local leaders. And then in 43 CE, within 3 generations, relations soured and Claudius conquered them by military force. Now let's dive into the archaeology of Boudica Part 1, Late Iron Age Britain and the Iceni.
During the Late Iron Age, in what we now call England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, there were dozens of different culture groups, though we now lump them all under, quote, Celtic tribes. But they had distinct rituals, cultural practices, beliefs, economies, lifestyles, and so it really is a disservice to try to lump them all under one thing. And almost all of the names that we call them nowadays come from either Greek or Latin sources, and so we aren't sure exactly what they called themselves. For the major players for Boudica's story, her tribe was called the Iceni, which that name comes from abbreviations that were found on coins minted in the Iceni lands well after Roman rule had already been established. So we don't know for sure what exactly those abbreviations meant. It's based on assumptions from other coins that have been found throughout the Roman Empire. So it's definitely an educated guess, but not likely that this is what everyone in the region called themselves at all times. Then we have the Catuvellauni, which were their neighbors to the southwest, and then the Trinovantes, which were their neighbors to the south and southeast. And while these are all separate culture groups, we see overall trends in the area, which is common throughout history, even when you do have separate culture groups living in roughly the same area. They tended to follow each other's lead when it came to certain aspects. For example, different types of necklaces called torques have been found at several different places, not just Iceni lands, which goes to show that they were a style that was recognized, and a lot of archaeologists have interpreted them as meaning some form of status symbol, either some sort of like political leader or economic leader, or possibly even just a household patriarch or matriarch. But they have been found along with other treasures that makes it obvious that whoever it belonged to was a very important person. And those sorts of symbols are very useful whenever you're making cultural and economic ties with the neighbors around you. So it makes sense that you would have those sorts of overlapping traditions continuing. And then when somebody comes up with a great idea, such as hill forts, for example, they're going to be built by different peoples and not only one people, because they're a very defensible position. And when the land around you allows for it, having those hills and then the additional built up land around it to make those barrier ditches that prevent cavalry from coming in. That's how you learn to deal with the fact that a lot of the people in the area are using cavalry and chariots in their warfare. So again, there are going to be a lot of overlapping traditional things which can teach us not just about the Iceni or not just about their neighboring tribes, but also about the region on a whole. Many of the different culture groups, including the Iceni, had central locations that seemed to be obvious workshops, markets, and gathering places. Then they would live in very rural areas because they were an agricultural society overall. The Iceni, who were Boudica's people, they had their central area at a place that the Romans called Venta Icenorum, which literally meant marketplace of the Iceni. And there's been a lot of archaeological evidence found there that this was a central gathering place and there was metalworking here. It's in the modern day Castor St. Edmund. And the Iceni territory in general is modern day Norfolk, most of Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. Archaeological evidence shows that Roman contact with a lot of the different tribes in southern Britain actually started as far back as the 2nd century BCE, but there wasn't any military presence there. There were no invasions happening. It was trade happening between the mainland, and it might not have even been direct trade. It could have been trade through the Gauls on the mainland to Rome, instead of directly Rome and the tribes of the British Isles connecting themselves. The Roman presence in England begins really with Julius Caesar in 54 BCE, when he led an initial expedition force and then a small invasion force onto the island. And he didn't actually capture any territory, but instead he got the Trinovantes and several other tribes, allegedly 5, according to him and other historians of the time, that were what's called client kings of Rome. So that meant that they were recognized as the leaders or representatives of their people, and they would be the ones dealing with Rome, but it would be in a type of economic relationship only, and not the type of military presence or administrative presence that would come with being an actual province of Rome. That's not to say there wasn't any bloodshed, though, because whenever Caesar arrived, the Trinovantes allegedly allied with Rome in order to use Caesar in order to get revenge on the Catuvillani, who had recently killed the father of their current leader, who became the client king, in a raid or some sort of other large-scale dispute that was going on between the tribes. In doing so, this also established the Trinovantes as a fairly important piece to the Roman Empire at the time when it came to the economy with trading with the British Isles. And then that allowed the Romans to take a lot of the Catuvillani land and put it under Trinovantes' rule, at least officially according to Rome. Now, we don't know if this was exactly followed. This, again, all comes from texts that were written by Romans, some even generations after the fact. So these texts were written with some bias, for sure, and there's no archaeological evidence either way of the Trinovantes specifically ruling with any sort of power over the Catuvellauni because there was so much overlapping cultural material already. There is just evidence of an increase in Roman trade goods. So there's clearly a path that Rome was able to get to in order to increase trade in the area. The Trinovantes and the Catuvellauni and the Iceni were not the only of these client kings of Rome or client kingdoms of Rome. Many of the southern and eastern tribes that were along England's coast and had more access to the mainland became client kings with Rome. And this continued for quite a while because, again, there were so many things that Rome had to focus on the mainland, especially with how much that Caesar had expanded the empire. There were several uprisings in Gaul that prevented Caesar himself from coming back, and then his own death and his attentions on Egypt as well. And so you have several decades and generations where people are peacefully living and making a lot of money off the Roman Empire. During this time, we also see an increase in a wealth gap between the people who are merchants and have access to trade with the Romans and the people who have less commodified trade goods. Metalworkers, for example, will see a huge increase in wealth during this time, and there's a lot of coin minting that goes on as well. It's also important to note that the terms client kings, or even referencing queens when it comes to any tribe in the British Isles, is again assigning Roman terminology onto these people. We don't know exactly how their power structure was, if there was one single unified king or queen who ruled over any level of people, if it was some sort of elected officials. All we can tell from the archaeological record is that there were people who clearly had more possessions and more power based on their location of burial, the size of their homes, the size of their burials, and the amount of trade goods that are buried with them. Without specific texts from the Iceni or any of the other tribes themselves, which we do not have and will never have, because the concept of writing things down was not a universal idea throughout the world at the time. Most peoples were happy to live mostly in the moment and through telling oral stories of their histories and maintaining their culture that way. I will probably just be reminding you multiple times that a lot of this comes from very Roman bias, so that I can make it as clear as possible that a lot of this entire tale, like Boudica's story, the evidence that we have initially all comes from the Roman side. But now we have archaeological evidence that's starting to back up the truth of what exactly happened, whether there was any level of Roman omissions where they didn't want people to know certain aspects, or whether there were Roman embellishments where they wanted to make themselves or someone else seem better for whatever reason. I will definitely be going into a lot of the critiques about the Roman bias specifically later, but now we'll get back to explaining just the history of this area and give you a bit more of the picture of the buildup to Boudica's rebellion. So these client kings, they had very complicated relationships with Rome as military presence did start to move in. A lot of these client kings had gained a lot of wealth through their interactions with Rome over time. A lot of people have been able to establish a lot of power that they were able to pass directly to their sons. We can tell based off of coinage that was minted during this time. And it's unclear if that was something that was as traditional prior to this or not. In fact, a lot of the evidence we have shows that the peoples of England especially, but a lot of the quote-unquote Celtic tribes of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland were what's called matrilocal societies. And that means that when a couple gets married, the husband is going to be the one that moves to his wife's people. They're going to stay around the wife's family. They're going to honor the wife's family closely. It's a tradition that's not commonly seen in the archaeological record or written history or even modern times. The traditions are often the other way around, where the woman is the one who goes and lives with her husband's family. So this does indicate that women held power, because otherwise, why would there be an intentional choice to live near all of these matriarchs like that? And a lot of the grave goods also point to that, because skeletons that lean with a lot of female traits, they tend to have a lot of grave goods and even weapons or horse harnesses and all sorts of evidence that shows that they were active leaders as well as men. So if it is possible that prior to Roman rule, a lot of inheritance was actually done through a matrilineal progression instead of it being a patrilineal, which is basically what we are used to now in our modern society. Over time, the children of all of these client kings and potentially client queens were sent off to Rome in order to learn Latin and be educated in a lot of the Western Roman ways, though I suppose for them it would have been Eastern. And then they would come back with a lot of Roman-based ideals. And then around this time, when there's clear evidence of trade and the client-king relationships, but no military domination yet, we start to see cities building up in places that were previously hill forts and more scattered settlements. There are more planned cities that are seemingly inspired by Rome, or at the very least inspired by traveling to these larger cities on the mainland. One of these examples is called Duropolis by archaeologists because it's in the land of the Durotriges, which are in the southern part of England, further from the Iceni, and were not directly related to Boudica's revolt. But their case study is very interesting because we see around the same exact time of their hill forts in the area being abandoned, the buildup of this city called Duropolis, again by modern archaeologists, that was more planned out and was less defended. And so the fact that it was less defended also goes to show that this was a period of peace with Rome and the mainland overall, when you have these southern, essentially border tribes, because they're along the coast, no longer feeling the need for these Iron Age hill forts to protect themselves, and now in these more open cities. This also goes to show that there was a large enough established population and enough trade goods, food, and everything needed in order to maintain this sizable population for a long period of time to justify this level of stability. Again, all pointing towards great relations with Rome and the mainland overall during this period, at the very least for the very southern coastal tribes, though the Iceni are further north. Their archaeology is very interesting too, because it again shows very little in the way of defensive fortifications. There are some ditches which archaeologists have interpreted as defensive in order to block chariots, but otherwise there's no big earthworks or hill forts there that they seem to have needed. A lot of their settlements were roundhouses that were in the flat agricultural lands. And the Iceni have a larger percentage of horse-related gear, horse burials, and chariots and their fittings than most of the other culture groups in this area, which goes to show that they were a very equestrian-based peoples, and that was most likely the core of their economy. There's also a lot of evidence that they trained hunting dogs, and based on some of the genetics that have been done testing the bones of some of these hunting dogs, it shows that they were bred and then traded fairly far, and some even onto the mainland. So it's possible that the Iceni were specifically known far and wide for their equestrian skills, their ability to train hunting dogs, and overall a more hunting lifestyle and skill set than a warrior skill set. They did still have a very agrarian culture, so that meant that they have sedentary settlements. They're not moving around nomadically with what's called pastoral nomads, which means that they move with their herds or anything like that. They had established fields and they were growing their own foods and grains. So it's very interesting to see this established acceptance of an animal that was no longer native to the area. The horse history of the English Isles are a little bit complicated, but the summary is they were there, they went extinct, and then they were brought from the mainland later, and then well established with now a lot of these native populations that we've come to recognize, like the Shetland ponies. So it's very cool how, especially here, we see a lot of the evidence of horses being very, very important to this culture group and their specific identity.
Horses and chariots in general may have been so important to several cultures that they were actually used as status symbols. There's a lot of archaeological evidence that shows the Iceni and several other tribes amongst what is now modern day England had a lot more hordes of horse gear, like harnesses or chariot fittings or horse bridles and things of that nature than they did of treasures like jewelry that was meant for humans or even coins. And that shift of importance when you go into those regions definitely shows that there's a history there of that being recognized as an important status symbol further out than just local. It wasn't only the Iceni who recognized that. We see it amongst several other tribes as well, and it spreads out through a lot of the more northern parts of England. And similar to other deposits of status symbols, a lot of these hoards show that the artifacts within them were ritually destroyed. So they weren't just buried and people expected to come back later for them, like with several other like Roman hoards or other styles of treasure hoards that have been found. Instead, these were intentionally broken and or burned in irreparable ways. So they couldn't just be dug up and repaired. They were intentionally destroyed and then buried. This isn't really clear why. A lot of archaeologists have said it might have been a way to honor the dead, showing that this was essentially their status symbol alone, not something that could be taken and disseminated amongst either enemies, friends, family, whatever. So there's also been interpretations that say perhaps this was their view of taking things to the afterlife, the way that other cultures would have included these sort of detailed artifacts within their tombs, like we see in ancient Egypt a lot. Most of these hoards of horse gear are also very decorative and not just plain iron horse fittings. They're intricate metalwork, a lot of times copper, bronze, sometimes even silver worked within it, and they're painted. So it wasn't just your everyday average workhorse's gear. A specific example of an Iceni horse hoard would be at Ringstead in West Norfolk, where there's a hoard of harnesses and horse fittings that have been dated to about 40 BCE. This would have been after Caesar appeared, but before the actual Roman military conquest of Britain. And here there were multiple bridle bits, clasps, harnesses, and the fittings for various horse harnesses, and also metal ingots of silver and pure copper. So those would have been used as actual trade goods for essentially monetary value worth their weight in silver, not gold. And then there were rivets, which were pieces of the chariots that would have been connected with the harnesses to the horses that would have led them. And along with this hoard of horse gear, there were also 2 bronze plates that seemed to form a shield that would have been dated to a little bit before the time that these artifacts were buried. It's hard to tell with the state the shield was in whether it was actually functional or decorative, but it is interesting that it's with all of these other goods, and with other finds that have been found in hoards throughout Britain, it was most likely decorative, and these were all status symbols for this person, though there's no direct burial here. And that's what's usually interesting about the hoards, is they're not associated directly with a burial. They're often in places seemingly unexpected. And so it's not always clear why exactly they were buried this way. Just in March of this year, 2025, there was a brand new announcement of a hoard that was found in Melonsby in North Yorkshire that had over 800 artifacts, and most of them are associated with horses. They were originally found by a metal detectorist in 2021, who then contacted a local archaeologist. In the UK, metal detectorists generally have a lot of integrity, and they have their own rule system to where if they find certain things, they contact archaeologists. Because the thing about UK history, especially metal history, is there's quite a lot of it, especially what Americans would consider a long time ago in the Victorian era. There are plenty of commonplace Victorian era surface finds that are pretty normal for people to pick up and actually take home, especially metal detectorists or people who go mudlarking. And when they do find these older caches, they do, again, alert local archaeologists, as they did in this case. And excavations began with the archaeologist that was contacted in 2022. The dates after research has been done on these first few batches of finds that have come up show that this was either just before or very soon after the Roman military conquest of Britain. So this was either a client king or one of the early Roman elite colonists that would have been here very early on in the more militant relationship of Rome with the Isles. I will not be naming off all 800 artifacts, do not worry, but some specific ones that are of importance are 14 harnesses that were found for horses to connect them to chariots, and they were very, very well decorated with colorful glass and Mediterranean coral. These materials are very interesting because this shows that the owner was very wealthy and they had connections throughout the Roman trade network. There are wheels and pieces for at least 7 chariots, so likely 2 horses per chariot, and there's fittings for even more horse gear. It's unclear if that would have been like all actively used at the same time, or if this was a collection of goods. Along with all of that, there were 3 very, very ornate spears. They're very clearly ceremonial or decorative, not at all practical. And there was also a very large bowl that was decorated with both Iron Age Celtic designs and Mediterranean designs. So again, this shows that this was a very, very wealthy person who had connections, but intentionally chose to mix a lot of these traditions from the local community with the Romans that were coming in. So the evidence tends to point more towards a client king than a newly arrived colonist from Rome, who would have been more likely to bring their own culture here with them before adapting into the local customs. From the time when Caesar first arrived with his forces to the time that Claudius invaded, there was a lot of trade increasing really, really fast, and a lot of these client kings, like this person most likely, were gaining more and more wealth. And they were starting to display status through material goods more like Romans did than their previous traditions had shown in the archaeological record. It was during this period of time that Boudica was allegedly born. Now, I say that because the information we know about Boudica comes from Tacitus, a Roman writer who wrote about her in the Agricola in 98 CE and then in the Annals in 115 CE. This was many, many years after the Boudican rebellion. Tacitus would have been 4 to 5 years old when Boudica's rebellion happened, and the details he wrote came from his father-in-law, Agricola, who recounted his portion in it towards the end, and then secondhand reports from the beginning. So this was all done many years after the fact, and the information can definitely be taken with bias as well, because the targeted audience was going to be Roman readers. But we shouldn't completely discount Tacitus or the later writer Dio, who also wrote about Boudica, because both of them gave details that were proven facts within their greater writings and some details within their writings about Boudica herself. For example, specifically, they both describe Boudica wearing styles of wool clothing that has actually been found in the archaeological record that was in fashion in Iron Age Britain before a lot of Roman influence came along. And they describe the torque, which was a style of necklace that was worn around Boudica's neck, as well as the importance of the brooch that she wore, though they didn't give details on what the brooch looked like. And all of these things do point towards factual information for clothing worn by pre-Roman Britons during this time period. And it would have been an important way for her to show her own loyalties by choosing to wear her traditional clothing over anything that was actually Roman inspired if she was in fact leading a revolt. So these facts do show that there's enough that we should take these writers seriously when we do consider whether or not Boudica herself was an actual historical figure. Historians agree that she likely was real, but it's unlikely that the Roman authors would have known her true age at the time of the rebellion. They just base it off of the fact that she already had nearly adult daughters by Roman standards, and that she was also married to a client king. So that would have put her roughly in her early 30s by Roman standards. But whatever the real year of her birth, she would have grown up in this time of very, very quick change that was going on from the time that Caesar arrived to the time that the Romans actually invaded. It had likely already been several generations of contact, both negative and positive, with Rome for various people across southern England. Maybe even for the Iceni. We aren't, again, sure, because a lot of this comes from biased Roman writing. Client kings during this period began plotting to use Rome for their own devices, according to a lot of the Roman authors. What the archaeological evidence shows is that there was an increase in the production of chariots and horse fittings over the production of jewelry and other more household goods. But it's unclear if that was due to mercenary work, as they were either themselves going out to work for the Romans, or if they were simply equipping the Romans, or maybe even other British tribes of this area that were standing against the Romans. There's a long list of possible what ifs for why this shift happened. But another potential that I would like to bring up is potentially they were feeling the need to defend themselves against Rome during this period, as this divide in pro-Roman sentiment and anti-Roman sentiment started growing. Tacitus and Dio both, again, blame the Trinovantes and the Cativellauni for trying to use Rome in their own personal grudges against each other, and this is what gives Claudius, the emperor at the time, the excuse to bring in an invasion force and conquer Britain in 43 CE. According to Claudius's triumphal arch, 11 Celtic tribes swore him fealty after his invasion, though the names have been lost to time, either a combination of weathering and unintentional damage, and then intentional damage done throughout the centuries that since it was built. However, the Roman authors do say that the Iceni, or at least Boudica's people, were not conquered by military force, and the archaeological evidence tends to point towards that as well. It seems that the Iceni entered an alliance willingly as a client kingdom with Rome instead of being conquered through military force, though it's unclear if they were previously client kings and this was essentially a renewed contract, or if this was the beginning of a brand new contract with the Iceni. This is where the Roman writers name the first and only Iceni client king, as they call them within their texts, and that's Prasutagus, who is Boudica's husband. Prasutagus is also depicted on some Iceni coins from the period, so there is archaeological evidence of him existing, though it's not 100% clear because, similar to the Iceni name, abbreviations are used and it's a Latinized form, so it's not even clear if Prasutagus is even a variation of his Celtic name or not. And once again, we don't know if he was actually seen as a king by the Iceni, if he was even able to speak for all of the Iceni people. He could have simply been the head of a merchant household, or he could have actually been an elected leader chosen to represent the entire wider community of settlements in order to make contact with Rome. He could have been randomly selected by Rome and not even recognized fully by the locals. We aren't 100% sure because there's no definitive proof that he as a person was revered by any of the Iceni at all. We don't even know if any of the elite graves that have been found in Iceni territory would have been his, because they wouldn't have identified their leaders through any sort of Romanized name like that. It's entirely possible that archaeologists have already excavated his tomb and simply don't know it. As I've said repeatedly, unfortunately, I feel like a broken record. We don't have much evidence from the point of the Iceni or any of the other native peoples to Britain at the time of Roman conquest. And all of the sources that we have come from very heavily Roman-biased accounts. We've been filling in the gaps with archaeological finds over the years, and hopefully over time we'll get more and more so that we can piece together even more context of the Iceni from their point of view, and many more of the other Celtic tribes. New archaeological evidence is coming out every year that teaches us more and more about the very separate and distinct identities that these different culture groups had that lived along what we call the Celtic British Isles during the late Iron Age period. And I certainly can't wait to see what else keeps coming out, especially as more and more of these projects are getting funded through local universities and also more and more crowdfunding campaigns to fund these sorts of digs. Thanks for listening to the Archaeology of Boudica Part 1, Late Iron Age Britain and the Iceni. In the next episode, we'll delve into the ways that Roman occupation after Claudius's invasion impacted the native Celtic peoples. And I'll look into the series of events that led to Boudica's revolt so that you can see that there is a chain of events and it didn't just happen out of nowhere one day. I'll also share the archaeological evidence that confirms that it really did happen, and this wasn't just a fantastical tale written down by Roman authors. Thanks again. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the Past Macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
When it's this cold, curl up with a snack that's cozy and delicious, like My Mochi ice cream. My Mochi is scoops of premium ice cream wrapped in soft dough with delicious flavors like strawberry and mango. It's creamy on the inside and chewy on the outside, and only 70 calories apiece. Grab a warm blanket and snuggle up with a purple box of My Mochi ice cream today. It's the perfect wintertime treat.